Hello, everyone. Oh, round of applause. Thank you. You know what? I haven't had a single round of applause when I've walked on yet, so I'm going to take that. Thank you. Welcome to the Earth stage here at the Founders Summit. Part 3 of the day. So the whole aim of the Founders Summit has been a day dedicated to providing actionable content for founders. Just a really quick thank you to our supporting sponsor, Vonage, and our strategic partner, Atico, as well. So just before lunch, if you were with us, we looked at the evolve stage of the journey, which was just all about exploring strategies to manage your product, user experience, and how to strengthen your brand. And now we're going to move to the lift section of the day, where we will explore opportunities and how to ensure early stage founders are on the right path for long-term success. And we're kicking off with a bit of a panel talk all around scaling your teams and their skill sets. And here to take you through this panel talk is Senior Content Manager from Hayflow. Please join me in welcoming on stage is Nasia Kudaibergen. You have got a fantastic audience here. I'm going to leave you. I hope this continues.
Awesome.
Enjoy.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session, Scaling Your Team and Skill Set. The goal of this session is for all of you folks who are pre-Series A, getting ready to scale, to come out of here with some concrete learnings, strategies, and best practices on how to scale your team effectively and how to develop the necessary skill sets to support your company's growth. And for that, we have 2 experts with us here today. And please join me in welcoming Katrina Walker. Katrina is the CEO and founder of CodeUp, a NetTech company on a mission to diversify tech, offering education to women, trans, and non-binary people. And CodeUp has received awards from TEDx Barcelona, Women in Tech Spain, the Spanish Startup Association. And prior to founding CodeUp, Katrina was working as a data scientist, both in the public and in the corporate sector. And Katrina is also a startup mentor at UNDP and 4 years from now's Women Innovators Program. Welcome, Katrina.
Thanks for having me.
Then with us is also Jens Heitland. Jens is the CEO and founder of Succeed, a leadership skills assessment. Yes, welcome, Jens Heitland, everybody. Jens is the CEO and founder of Succeed, a leadership skills assessment and education system, helping managers be better leaders. And prior to founding Succeed, Jens was driving teams and driving innovation at companies such as IKEA, Deutsche Bank, and Foot Locker. And Jens is also mentoring startups and entrepreneurs at programs such as Start2Be and 4 years from now's Women Innovators Program. Welcome, Jens.
Thank you.
All right. Katrina, Jens, great to have you here. So our session is about scaling your team and skill set. Let's start with the second part, maybe, on how me as a leader, as a founder, can be prepared well to scale my business. What would you say are some of the essential skills that I need in order to scale my business successfully?
Yeah, absolutely. So at least 2, right? When you're scaling, essentially what you're asked to do is to navigate a lot of complexity in a system that is in constant flux, ensuring that you maintain the stability of the company, don't compromise the quality of the product. There are a lot of variables happening there. And so at least first, you need to focus. We know that one of the main reasons why startups fail is that they lose focus. So when you're scaling, it's easy to get lost in all these different variables. Even more than focus, I think, too, you need a certain sensibility to determine where do you put your focus, what do you prioritize. That's not an easy thing to do. No, we can say that from a theoretical perspective, but really determining where to put those weights is a challenge, especially if you're a first-time founder. In this case, I think having advisors that have experience are really, really key to doing this. The second thing I would say that is fundamentally important is to understand how much humanity is needed in the work that you're doing. When we're talking about business, scale-ups, teams, it's inherently relational. And so when you're building out your growth strategy, when you're thinking about hiring, you're talking about people many times uprooting their family, losing their savings to fly somewhere, And so you need to understand every time you're hiring someone and firing what those stories are. And that's an immense responsibility. And so this always needs to be at the forefront of thought. These 2 points, I think at least, are quite fundamental.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. What do you think, Jens? What are some of the essential skills I need for scaling?
I would say there are different stages where you're going through when you're in a startup. So the early stages is like you hustle and bustle, you get your ass moving, and try to figure out how to get a product into the market that is like valued and people want to give you money for. And while you're scaling, the number one skill I have seen with the startups I mentored over the last years is like leading yourself as a founding team. Like understanding yourself on what are the critical things that keep you moving over time. And then when you're growing and you get a little bit of funding, you're getting a little bit of traction and you're onboarding team members, then it's how the hell do I lead other people? Because most of us don't have the background where you have like gazillions of leadership trainings and you know exactly how all the pain points to solve. You need to learn this on the go while you're flying an airplane, literally. And that's really something where you can start today if you're an early stage startup. And if you're not an early stage startup anymore, you need to get into like, how do I lead people? Yeah. And through lead people, then scaling the startup. Because at least I have not met a startup that needs to onboard people while they're scaling. Not need to onboard people, I have to say. It's a critical skill you need to have as a founder, because the tricky thing is, if you don't have that skill, if you get Series A funding, the investors will change you. So I have seen that happening. A founder was changed from a CEO position to be the technology guy only, and he was not happy with that. And the startup went down because the investors have decided. Not saying that it's always negative, but that can happen if you don't know how to lead and scale a team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. We would want to avoid that, of course, at any cost. Where do I get started? So leading people, leading teams consists of different aspects, right? Like, what are the typical key skills or key aspects of leading people that I should learn?
Shall I go first? I mean, I have worked a little bit with that topic in the past, so I have to say. So, I mean, leading people, the number one skill is emotional intelligence. The tricky thing, the emotional intelligence part, is not something you have directly. Some of us are luckily having that. Others of us, especially when you come, like I'm an engineer myself, I needed to learn this the hard way, which is like getting in front of people and really learning how to work with them and learning how to listen and really digging into like what is empathy and how do you use empathy in different cultures elements, and most probably go later on into that. How does that work in a digital environment where you're not in the physical space together? So empathy is number one thing. And then super important is like, how do you convince other people? It's not just a leadership skill, it's also a sales skill. I have mentored startups from Start UB, the Barcelona University, and that's one of the lacking skills of some of the startups. If you can't sell, if you can't convince people and can't motivate people, you will have a different and difficult time in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Katrina, how would you say, how important is delegation? Because as we scale our startup, as our team gets bigger, as the business gets more complex, at some point, we can't be involved in all of the decisions anymore, right? Yeah. So what would you say is the role of delegation and how to tackle it?
Yeah, so I just had a hard lesson about this because my assumption was, okay, you hire people that have a domain expertise who are smarter in an area than you, because that is what you're hiring them to do. You give them the space to lead. You've delegated it. You're a great CEO, and you sort of sit back and you wait for things to be delivered to you. What happens is you quickly lose control, and you don't know what's being prioritized while you are the person ultimately responsible for driving the company forward. So delegation is certainly important, but when you're an early stage startup, you need to make sure as a leader that you're involved with all those driving forces of your company. And so as you're hiring, it's not just 100% delegating, even if they're a lead, a certain vertical at the company. You need to be working together to really capitalize and leverage that domain expertise. So it's a bit of an art, but I would say 100% you need to be really hands-on, otherwise it becomes dangerous.
You mentioned that it was a painful lesson for you to learn. Could you give a bit more context on like what were the consequences when you felt? From what I understand, you mean that at some point when you founded your business, you let the reins too loose too soon.
Yeah. But yeah, so basically, this was the lesson. So I can give you an example with marketing at CodeUp, and this really feeds into scaling your company. Do you hire someone permanently full time, or are you leveraging freelancers, marketing agencies, etc.? And so at CodeUp, we never had a chief marketeer. We've never had someone who was 100% on the team doing marketing, which meant for years we're going through marketing agencies and we're losing a lot of insight. No, and I had this assumption that I'm hiring a marketing agency that has this expertise. They should be delivering to me. And then I had my ass kicked recently by a new advisor who said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa! You need to step in. You cannot assume a marketing agency has all this insight and information." And I am now involved 100% on driving that and thinking, even with a marketing agent or a consultant, as they're partners with me, and we're thinking together. So we lost money, we've lost time, and we quickly had to mediate that.
Okay. Right, so there's this one extreme of letting the reins too loose too soon. Then there's also the counterpart of not letting go of control and wanting to stay involved like in all of the operations and all of the decisions. How would you say, what would you advise founders, how can they find the middle ground, like the optimal level in between?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, say you're hiring a head of finance, no? This is technical information, and so there might be a steep learning curve for you if you're a founder or a CEO that doesn't have that background of information. So you need to understand that very, very quickly. It doesn't mean that when you're building the business model, you're writing all the formulas in the Excel spreadsheet, but you are guiding the parameters of that business model. And so this is where there's implementation, there's being involved with the scope of a project, there's feedback that needs to constantly be happening, so you're working together. You sort of pick and choose, no?
Okay, makes sense.
Maybe just to add on to that point, very practical. How do you delegate a task? That's the first simple thing, like delegating one task to one specific other person. If you can't do that, that's definitely limiting you from scaling. And then how do you build that out that you have a systemic way of delegating tasks to other people? In corporate, you have like role descriptions which allow you to understand what the person is doing and going deeper into what their task is. And then as a manager, you need to understand what are the different departments who are doing that. Because if we are talking about scaling, you're building an organizational structure which you most probably in the beginning don't have. You have 5 guys that are working on something and figuring it out. And then over time, if you're scaling above 20, let's say, you need to build a department structure where you go more into the formal way of delegating. You are the head of sales, and as the head of sales, you have a sales department, and the task of the sales department are this, and they're different than the task from the marketing department. So really building that structure, though that you're very early still, helps you to systematize and increase the speed of scaling. Because if you do this, if you have 50, you will have a problem. It's really getting early on that and building maybe an artificial structure in the beginning, which sounds weird because you want to have the agile system of a startup, but it limiting you from scaling because you need to onboard people. I've worked with some of the extreme scaling startups. They're onboarding hundreds of people per month. If you don't have a structure to do that, it's not possible. So really build something that helps you on a one-on-one, like how do you delegate tasks and follow through and do that in the details, but as well, how do you do that systemic as a company?
And if you talk about a systematical way of doing that, is part of that also, for example, a decision framework? So for example, because as a leader, as a founder, how do I decide, I want to enable my team to take decisions themselves, and then how do I decide the kind of decisions that they should take and when they should come to me? How can I enable my team?
Yeah, this goes really back to how do you see yourself as a management team? So you have the founding team, then you have the CEO, and I think that's really like, what is your role? What is your role as a managing team, and how do you cascade the different tasks of the organization into the rest of the team. So building that structure, and there's like a very, very simple tool which you can do in Excel or Google Sheets, like RACI, who is responsible, who is accountable, who is contributing, and who is informed. You can Google that. Very simple, but having clarified who is doing what and how in the organization will help you to get these things rolling. And then really nailing that over the time while scaling to be able to really speed up the scaling part.
Yeah, in my experience, decision-making process is a really inherently messy process. And while I'd like there to be one framework that I think works, it's really context-dependent. There might be some decisions that need to be made in which it's executive decision-making, there's not a lot of time. There are other decisions that will require building consensus, and you really want to get the team buy-in. Or you're working in a terrain that's really unfamiliar, and you need to tap into the business acumen of an advisor. So flexibility, I think, is quite key here. Now, I'm not talking about when you're hiring 200 people plus. No, that's a different ball game. But in those early stage moments, you need this flexibility. I'd say more than an actual framework too is cultivating a culture by which people feel safe to voice their opinion. There is a culture where everyone's voice matters. You are soliciting that as a leader. A really good friend of mine, serial entrepreneur, he made it a point that for the first 30 employees, he was doing monthly one-on-one check-ins to just sort of gauge what the word out is on street. How are they feeling about the company? And so I think these kinds of meetings, as well as board debriefs, monthly town halls, that kind of transparency that's not about being honest, but is inherently an educational process where they're understanding what are the ethos and the logics, how do we think as a company, call it indoctrination, but it's a really powerful moment when you take a step back to let one of your team members step in, and they're beautifully capturing the ethos and the culture and the logic, the mission of the team, often more eloquently than you.
Yeah, I think you touched a very interesting point there, because the topic of culture is one that, as I found my business and we get started, and when we're a small group, we're a family, it's relatively easy to maintain like a certain company culture, a team culture, and then as I scale, there are some challenges and some complexities around maintaining and preserving that culture, right? So how can you, what kind of tips would you give to founders on how culture can be preserved in the process of scaling?
Do I go?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, culture is for me, it's one of the number one things you need to focus as a founder, especially while growing. And I think it's the CEO's and founding team responsibility to keep the culture going. One part is what we just talked about, is having individual meetings as the founding team with the team members. I have helped a startup from Canada. They have 30 people, and the founding team was disconnected from the normal employees. How can you be disconnected from normal employees with an amount of 30 people? Like, this is for me a no-go.
Yeah.
I have worked in companies with 500,000 employees, and then I understand that the CEO is maybe a little bit disconnected. Though even in these companies, the CEO spends time with the individuals, let's say, from the front line and going deeper, because it's a learning mechanism that you have. But it's also, going back to delegation, a delegation function which while scaling, you need to bring that into the management team. The management team needs to nurture the culture on an ongoing basis. It's your responsibility as the founding team to keep it. Because if you don't, you are the good example of whatever you do is seen with a magnifying glass. If you don't do this, nobody will do it. So you need to be the good example in doing that. That's then translated into the actions of the rest of the organization. For me, it's always, culture is the thing that happens when the manager goes out of the room. That's culture.
100%. Just to add to that, I think too, obviously having clearly defined values, this helps so everyone's quite clear. During the hiring process, the CEO, the leadership team is interviewing for the first 100 new hires. I think that this also sets the tone, and you need to make sure that you're bringing in the right people and that you're aligning on those values. As well as, I think, mentoring programs internally. So connecting newbies with folks who have been on the team, and they can be the transmitters of culture. I think that this can be a helpful tool.
Yeah, that's a good point. In my past companies, I always had like my buddy. We had a buddy system and like questions that you can ask to. So I think it definitely makes sense, and it's an effective way of maintaining culture. Another aspect of culture is the question of diversity, right? Like you founded CodeUp with the idea that there needs to be more diversity in tech. Now connecting it to scaling your business, what would you say is the role of diversity in scaling?
Yeah, well, I mean, give me an example where monocultures are ever a good thing. No, we have like an oversupply of corn, and now corn syrups and batteries and dog food. So no, just to say that I think diversity, building teams, be it a sports team or a startup, is for me one of the most beautiful components of my role. I see it as weaving together a tapestry or a quilt in which every square is slightly different, but there is this connection between all the differences. That is the richness and the kind of ecosystem that I think is really fundamental for certainly building innovation. And so I know diversity can be tricky when you're tasked with scaling quickly. It might mean that you actually need to invest in it, and it's a longer-term strategy. I think it's important to do both. No, I can give you an example. We worked with a really big tech company who it was women-led. The product was predominantly for women. And when they looked at their engineering team, they saw that, in fact, they were below industry standards for diversity on their engineering teams. So they decided to put together a junior training program by which they could really tap into create a bigger supply of diverse talent by bringing in juniors. So I think these sort of junior programs can be highly rewarding and have a nice ROI, but it's a long-term strategy.
Yeah, it makes sense. Because, I mean, this is something that I hear a lot from founders who have this desire for diversity. They say like, okay, I get it. I understand diversity is important. I want to have diversity, but if I have this open position. For example, you named the typical example, an engineering position. 90% of my candidate pool are male applicants, and only 10% are women, right? So I could have this role hired so much faster if I just take one of the men, not necessarily because the male candidates are better, but just because if there's so much more choice, then probability is higher that they're gonna fit, like the skill set, etc. So what would you say to those founders who are like, I want to scale faster, and then this diversity thing might slow down my scaling process?
Sure. It's statistics, no? At the senior level, it's gonna be more challenging. It exists. You might have to put more resource into it, and it can be very competitive amongst companies to tap into that talent, which is why you might downgrade the level for which you're hiring, invest in juniors. We had in 2 weeks 1,800 applications of diverse women from around the world who wanted to start their careers as junior engineers. And so this is where you have to balance those two things out.
Right, makes sense. Jens, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's critical. We're living in a world where, especially most of you, I guess, are focusing on growing global or at least growing international. It's not just male and female, like the obvious things. It's also like, what are the diverse people of the different markets you want to serve? Like if you are focusing on Spanish market and you're a startup in Germany, as an example, and you don't have a Spanish team member, it's very hard. So you need to look as well as at the totality. Going back to the example, if there's an engineer, I would hire the best engineer. Like, if you ask me, hire the best person you can get. If that's female, male, doesn't matter the background. Hire the best person as a starting point. But then over time, look that you build diversity in. That you have not just different cultural backgrounds, but also different ways of thinking. Like, I have a very corporate background, and I think in different think patterns or thought patterns. And there are other people who are coming from a completely different angle, that grown up through the startup world, And there's a different way of interacting with each other. And through that, you will make decisions specifically as a management team when you're scaling that help you to be better. And that's what you need to look for. I always did the mistake in the beginning that I hired the people that are like me because I like myself. And I understand that that's a human thing, but that's something you need to go away from. You need to hire people for a purpose, and that's where the management and the founding team needs to be strong and looking into what is the missing piece we're looking for. Maybe you need a communicator, maybe you need someone with a more sales background, maybe you need someone with a marketing background, maybe you need someone with a cultural different background if you want to grow towards Asia. That's something you need to strategize as a scaling function, because if you don't, then you end up with the same approach, and that will limit your growth definitely.
Yeah, finding people who complement you basically,
Exactly.
and not the same. You mentioned one common mistake already, that mistake of hiring people who are similar to you. What other typical mistakes do you see startups and leaders make when scaling?
Right. So I think there is this tendency to think quantitatively when we talk about scaling. In my experience, I've seen that one strong employee is like 3. And the converse also holds true. One weak employee takes the resource of 2 other employees. And so we need to take a step back when we're creating our business plan and our hiring plans to not just think, hey, more people means greater output. Haste makes waste. So this is one thing I've definitely seen. Another thing is that we grow too quickly. Right, and so this is another personal experience in which you close a round, you have money, you have this business plan that looks really great, and you start growing before you've really honed in on what that growth variable is to activate. And so what happens? You burn through cash really quickly. You're not controlling all these different experiments for determining what model you want to use to grow. And nothing works, and you have to take a couple steps back, you've lost time, and you got to refactor things and scale down, in fact.
Right.
So, yeah, growing too quickly.
All right. What about you, Jens? What are typical mistakes you see?
For me, it's connected to the stages you're in. If you're an early stage startup, like say pre-seed, seed stage, then you most of the time you're, at least what I see with the startup, they love their product too much, that they are not willing to change anything. And that's sometimes good, but sometimes limiting factor. When you go towards Series A, and I need to go back to where I come from, which is the leadership thing, a lot of startup founders are not focusing on leadership, and through that, limiting the growth of the company. The product can be awesome, you have huge traction, but you can't bring the speed into the organization because you're lacking the skills in building the team that helps to grow. And that's something you need to learn over time, and stepping up your game personally as well to understand, what do I need to do as a manager of a company, because that's what you are as a founder, to build that company. It's not about you, it's not about your idea, it's about how do you build an engine that's building the future. And that's really building a team around it, not just technology. And that's a lot of startups, if you talk about tech startups, they come from that technical background. And we have not learned that, like myself as well. But that's a limiting factor. So that's something you can learn from today on. Just watch YouTube videos as a starting point. Be interested in that topic that helps you to scale. But it's one of the big challenges I see, especially with startups that are going into the growth. They're getting, like if you're in the US, you get 5 million funding. How do you do that? How do you take it to the next level and not just focus on the technology?
Just to say real quickly, ESA has a leadership program focused on scaling your startup for CEOs. And the premise is that in order to scale your company, you need to scale yourself as a CEO. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Okay.
Yeah,
definitely makes sense. Right, so in the last few minutes, if you had to give the audience, all of those founders who are pre-Series A, preparing to scale, if you had to give them one valuable advice, maybe a lesson that you learned on your own journey as a founder, as an entrepreneur, what's a valuable lesson that you would share with the audience?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just watching a video of Sam Altman talking to Stanford students, and he was saying that with a lot of the startups that he's worked with, He's saying that the first 3 hires, if they go bad, it's really hard to recover from that. And he goes on to say that Airbnb, it took them 5 months to hire their first employee. And so while there is a lot of pressure often to scale, you need to stay in control and you need to slow it down and find the right person. Otherwise, it's a losing game. And I think if you have the right investors, certainly they're going to support you that, despite the general pressures.
Be more mindful about hiring.
100%.
Yeah. What about you, Jens?
Yeah, I need to combine 2 things. One is don't just go for the funding. There are a lot of companies that don't need funding. A lot of startups just focus on, I need to get money to scale. Sometimes it's better to be slower and build a healthy company that gives revenue over time. That's number 1. And number 2 is really focus and zoom in on positivity. A positive mindset will change your game going forward. And keeping that over time, because like we all know, startup or business life in general is a roller coaster. Like there are days which are super good and there are days that suck. And you need to keep that mindset because you're responsible for a company. And as a founding team, let's say you're 3 or 4 people, depending on how big you are, you need to keep each other accountable on these things. Hey, you're negative today, what's going on? You're like having this culture that helps you to focus on positivity will help you to go through these difficult times. And understanding that as a founding or later on as a management team will help you to scale. Definitely focus on positive thinking.
That's a good end note to end the session on. Katrina and Jens, thank you so much for being with us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Katrina and Jens.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And also a big round of applause, please, for Nasia as well for taking us through that. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.